Coming into this season, it seemed as though the fight for the second Red Bull seat was firmly between two drivers, Sergio Perez and Daniel Ricciardo, with Ricciardo tipped to be the firm favourite to take over Perez's seat at Red Bull for 2025. But now, after the first 3 races of the season, it doesn't seem such a foregone conclusion, with Ricciardo not having a fantastic start to 2024. And suddenly it seems as though there are more contenders than first thought. In fact, it seems as though there are at least 4 drivers in contention for that second Red Bull seat for 2025, even though Red Bull has made it plainly clear that they are in no rush to decide who will fill that vacancy for next season. But with a lot of distractions from the outside that will surely delay a decision, it seems as though we will not find out who will be Max Verstappen's teammate for 2025 until at least mid-season. So let's have a look at the contenders. Now, the first contender is obviously Sergio Perez, who's obviously occupying that seat currently and has done since 2021. But he's obviously under a lot of pressure to try and prove to Red Bull that he is deserving and worthy of a contract extension. But I think that this is pretty much a done deal, that Perez will not stay on for 2025 and beyond. I think that Red Bull has already made their decision regarding Perez's future. I think they made their minds up during the middle of last year when he went through that sort of bad patch after his win in Baku, where he really was comprehensively beaten by Max Verstappen during the remainder of 2023, and Perez really was going through a bit of a rough patch where he wasn't able to perform and was often half a second or even more behind Max. The good news for Checo, though, is that he has actually started this season in good form. He obviously finished second in the first 2 races behind Verstappen and did a solid performance. You've got to say, he did everything that was expected of him, being the number 2 to Max at Red Bull. Although he was very much comprehensively beaten by Max in Bahrain. In Saudi Arabia, he only finished around 8 seconds behind Max at the checkered flag. Obviously, we know that he's a bit of a street circuit specialist, so he was always going to be stronger there than he was in Bahrain. But nevertheless, his performances during those first 2 races were solid. But the problem is that in Australia, his performance wasn't up to scratch. Even though he finished in P5, the problem is that his grid penalty for blocking Hülkenberg in qualifying left him further down the grid, and he wasn't able to use his car advantage to move himself up the field and be in contention for a podium, let alone a victory. And that will be where the concern lies for Red Bull, is that they can't rely on Perez to be able to pick up the pieces when Max isn't either on form or whether he has a car failure of some sort. He needs to be able to be there when Max isn't able to win the races, and that obviously wasn't the case in Australia. So that will be obviously a big concern for Red Bull. I think they were very much concerned when he was going through that difficult phase last year when he really wasn't performing. I think that Red Bull has already made their minds up on Perez, and I do not think that they will be retaining him for 2025. So if I am right, that will mean that Perez would be out, and that means we would obviously have a new driver in at Red Bull alongside Max. But who out of the remaining contenders do I think it could be? Well, let's start with Daniel Ricciardo, who at the start of the year, as I mentioned, was, I think, very much looked upon as the clear favourite to take over Perez's seat for 2025, given how he performed solidly during his comeback, when he obviously was drafted in by AlphaTauri in 2023 to replace the underperforming Nick de Vries. And despite obviously missing a few races through that injury picked up at the Dutch Grand Prix, he still performed solidly and had done enough really to earn a seat for 2024. But given how much he has struggled in these opening 3 races, Ricciardo does not look the favourite anymore to take over that seat at Red Bull. Really, you have to say that Ricciardo has been outperformed and beaten on a fair scale by Yuki Tsunoda in the other RB, and I think that will very much be a concern for Red Bull, who very much had all of their money, all of their chips bet on Ricciardo being the driver that they would choose to take over Perez's seat. But now that he is not performing as expected and really has had a very difficult start to the season, to the point where it looks as though his difficult 2 years at McLaren, all of those struggles that he went through during those 2 years have come back to haunt him in a way, and he's not getting the most out of the car, not getting the most out of himself. Ricciardo has been out-qualified by Tsunoda in all of the first 3 races, and he's only finished ahead of him once on track in those first 3 races, which was of course the first race in Bahrain when team orders and that debacle came into play. So really you have to say that he was a bit fortunate to finish ahead of Tsunoda during that particular race. And this would be the deciding factor in why Red Bull would choose or not choose Ricciardo to replace Perez for 2025. Ricciardo, for him, it is essential. He has to beat Tsunoda. He has to prove that he is the better option out of the two RB drivers. I think in that regard, Ricciardo coming into this year was under the most pressure out of all the contenders for that second Red Bull seat. He had to prove to Christian Horner, to Helmut Marko, that he was the driver that they could rely on to be Max Verstappen's teammate in 2025, that he's going to be the driver that will not only push Max harder and be closer to him both in qualifying and the races, he'll be there to pick up the pieces when Max isn't able to deliver on a particular weekend. But that, at the minute, given the way that he's performing, doesn't seem the case. So we've looked at one side of the RB garage, but now let's have a look at the other side in terms of Yuki Tsunoda, who for me, out of all the contenders that Red Bull will be looking at for 2025, is firmly the rank outsider, not through his own doing, but simply through Red Bull's mindset. That for me is a bit of a shame, because I think that Yuki has proved, particularly last year, I thought that he did a really fantastic job in 2023. He really did take a huge step in terms of his performance and the way that he was both performing on track, and I think the way that he also came across as a more mature racing driver, a more experienced racing driver. He definitely had shown that he had taken a huge leap compared to his previous 2 seasons. He very much ended 2023 on a high note. I think he very much revelled in that environment of AlphaTauri, obviously making huge improvements in the second half of the season with their car development, and obviously having Ricciardo as a teammate, as a reference, given obviously that Ricciardo is obviously a former Grand Prix winner. I think he very much relished that challenge of going up against somebody of Ricciardo's experience, and more often than not he did beat him, he did outperform him, and that very much has carried on into 2024. The performances from Yuki are still there. He's managing to beat Ricciardo hand over fist. He's doing the job that is expected of him. That is a particular teammate duel on the Formula 1 grid this season. As to who finishes ahead of who, that obviously is going to be huge, because it very much will possibly decide not only who could get promoted to Red Bull, but who may lose their seat for 2025, with of course the likes of Liam Lawson waiting in the wings. Now, even though Yuki's performances in the first 2 races weren't what you'd call spectacular, I thought he was absolutely on form in Melbourne, where obviously he managed to get the car into Q3 for the first time this season, and then back that up with a great drive on Sunday, finishing in P8, which obviously became P7 with Fernando Alonso's time penalty after the race. So he obviously gave RB their first points of the season. So that obviously will be a pleasing factor for Red Bull, but what will be a concern is that the way that he handled the team orders debacle in the first race of the season in Bahrain, when he was obviously ordered to let Ricciardo through, there was still that element of he can get very hot-headed over team radio. That will be obviously still a bit of a concern for Red Bull, that he doesn't have the maturity of a driver that is representing a race-winning team, a championship-winning team. But what I think doesn't fall in Yuki's favour is that it always feels as though Yuki has more to prove to Red Bull than other drivers. You never really hear after a race, after a good performance, even after Melbourne, you didn't hear Christian Horner, Helmut Marko singing his praises about what a great job he did. Even in years gone by, when he's put in a good performance, they don't seem to be talking to the media and saying what a great job he did. But he's one that they're very much looking and keeping an eye on for the future. It very much seems as though Yuki's future is going to be away from the Red Bull family in the next year or so. Whether that will be in 2025 or 2026, I think very much Yuki's future will probably be with Aston Martin, when they, of course, they team up with Honda, and Honda were very much like a Japanese driver in that team. So I think that Yuki will not be really much in contention for that Red Bull seat, regardless of how he performs this season, which I think is a shame, because I think if he does perform up to standards this year and does beat Ricciardo in the head-to-head duel by the end of the season, I think he very much deserves at least a chance to prove to Red Bull that he is a driver that very much can be in that second Red Bull seat. And that brings us on to the final contender, and the one driver out of all the contenders who is outside of the Red Bull fold. And we know that Red Bull, from down the years, is not afraid to look outside the Red Bull family to promote a driver from another team. They did the same with Perez, and they've done the same with Mark Webber. So this driver is obviously Carlos Sainz, who at the minute is the most informed driver in Formula 1. He is hot property at the minute, given the performances that he's put in the opening 3 races. He had a great result in the opening race in Bahrain, and then of course his drive in Australia from the front row to take a commanding win really was amazing, especially as obviously he missed the second race when he was struck down with appendicitis and obviously had to have an operation, and 16 days later he was winning the Australian Grand Prix in what was a demonstration of his tenacity, of his grit. I mean, it really was remarkable that Carlos was able to turn in such a performance, especially when he admitted that he wasn't 100% fit, given that he wasn't able to follow his usual regime because he spent most of the time lying in bed trying to recover from his operation. But given how he started the year in Bahrain, and given the drive that he put in Australia to take that victory, right now he is in the prime of his career. I think very much everyone agrees that Carlos is probably the most underrated driver on the grid right now, and very much underappreciated given what he's able to bring. What works in Carlos's advantage also is the fact that he's always performed well against tough opponents in the other car. He's obviously gone up against Max in Toro Rosso, he's gone up against Lando at McLaren, and then of course he's now gone up against Charles Leclerc at Ferrari, and all of them he's stood in good stead against, all of them performing well. And that is just one part of it. The main factor in this is that Carlos obviously is out of contract for 2025, given that Ferrari obviously has given him the boot in favour of signing Lewis Hamilton. So out of all the drivers that are out of contract and on the market, Carlos is very much at the top of that list as to the drivers you would want to sign who are available for next year. There was definitely an indication from Horner after the Australian Grand Prix that Red Bull are interested in taking Sainz for next year, although it does seem as though actually Red Bull were already interested in signing Sainz for 2025 even before his performance in Australia. But that drive in Melbourne I think will only help his cause and put him probably at the top of the list. So now that we've looked at all of the contenders, who out of all of them do I think that Red Bull should choose to partner Max in 2025? Well, the driver that I think that Red Bull should sign for 2025 is the most recent contender I have just talked about, and that is Carlos Sainz. I mean, why would Red Bull not take up the opportunity to try and sign Sainz when he is performing like he is? He's the most informed driver in Formula One at this moment in time. He is very much the best option out there. I think also you've got to also take into consideration that he would probably be a better option than Perez. I think that he would push Max much harder, looking at how he performs against Charles Leclerc in qualifying, and given that Leclerc is very much looked upon as the fastest driver in Formula 1, particularly over one lap, and given that he outqualified him in Melbourne and has outqualified him on a number of occasions, even if the gap is always probably in Leclerc's favour, slightly in Leclerc's favour, I think it shows what an amazing job he is doing and has done at Ferrari over these last few seasons. So for me, I think that Carlos would be the best option for Red Bull to take. I think that he would really elevate that team even further, make it even stronger. And as a pairing, I think Verstappen and Sainz, even though there obviously is that lingering doubt over whether there would be sort of fireworks, given how how competitive they were against each other at Toro Rosso. Now that they're older, more mature, more experienced, I think all of that will be put to bed, and I think actually they will be a really solid combination. So for me, Red Bull should be signing Carlos Sainz for 2025. So those are the drivers that I think will be in contention for that second Red Bull seat in 2025. But do you agree with the drivers that I've selected, or have I missed anybody out? And do you agree with the driver that I think that Red Bull should ultimately choose? Be sure to let me know your thoughts in the comment section. And also, if you're new around here, don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.